And we're live.
How are you,
Good
Dims?
evening, everybody. Good evening, Rise supporters. I don't see anyone yet. So I'm going to give it a few minutes and wait for a few people to join, and then we'll start officially.
Sure.
Is that fine with you, Dumi?
I'm completely okay with that. I'm at your mercy today.
Kind of. I'm so glad we have that understanding
The
before it's too late.
thought's too late.
But thanks for joining us. How are you feeling on this confused Sunday evening? I'm not sure if it's warm or rainy or what's happening.
I'm getting to the point where I've got year-end fatigue, nah? But that's also because it's definitely the 14th of January. And I'm not sure, but everybody is in this glorious movement of ours is making sacrifices on a daily basis. So it means we must continue pushing.
Yeah. Do you think it's running over from last year, the year end fatigue, or do you think it's like new year end fatigue?
I haven't really had a break, if I'm honest. I worked throughout December, so the I'm here. Three's a crowd. There's definitely a run over. I must just make sure I take better care of myself and sleep at a decent bedtime.
Sure.
Yeah. And you, how are
Yeah.
you?
At Rise, we're all about the politics of care. We're all organizing, but still making sure that we take care of ourselves.
Sure.
But we're going to chat about all of that a bit later on in our discussion. The politics of care, the politics of Rise, and what that has meant to you and what that looks like for you, especially as a young person in leadership. But I think I am just going to get going.
Sure.
So, good afternoon, Risers. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the very first Fireside Chat for the year 2024. For those of you who are new here, this is a series where we get to know our Rise leaders better. And so today we're joined by our head of internal democracy. His name is Boitumelo Mpakanyane. And I am particularly excited for tonight's conversation, I think for two main reasons, right? The first one is that he's obviously young. He's one of the youngest leaders we have on our National Leadership Collective, or the NLC. The second reason is that you've probably heard him say, I'm the head of internal democracy before. And it sounds great, but no one really knows what it means. No one really
For
knows what
other
it's
teams, I'm
about.
also still trying to figure it out.
Exactly. So tonight we finally get to understand what internal democracy is all about. I think especially on the back of a very successful candidate nomination and application process. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that. First things first. Hi, Dumi. Good evening. Welcome to Fireside Chats. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the warm welcome.
The pleasure's ours. Okay, first things first, right? Before we get into the incredible work that you are doing at Rise, we want to get to know Boitumelo. And so my first question is that simple. Who is Dumi? Who is Boitumelo? How do you relate your story?
I think I was actually reflecting on this a little bit earlier in the week, and also towards the end of last week. The only people who call me we do matter are people inside the Rise universe, and my mother when she's very angry with me. For the most part, people in my life call me Tumi, but I identify first and foremost as a South African. I think in terms of the things that define me, at the top of that list is that I'm a South African. I'm an older brother. I'm a younger brother. I'm a son. I'm an uncle to an ungrateful 3 month old. I'm joking. He's very adorable. He just doesn't. I don't know if he likes me. And yeah, just I'm a very family orientated person. I've always believed very strongly that the most important institution in any society is a family.
Mm.
I think I navigate my family that way, but especially in my work, with that belief informing a lot of the work I do. But yeah, I come from a very politically active family. I come from a family of politicians and entrepreneurs, and um, a family that from a very young age teaches a very strong action orientation. You know, the coming of age of someone in my family, get a degree and a job, and it's in my family you're respected when you start um, putting back value into the communities that raised you. And if there's something about society, about your community, about your country that you don't like, who must change it if not you? And this informs a lot of the ethics in my family around entrepreneurship, around leadership, and all of those things. So I think leadership is a kind of is a calling of service in my family, and that's kind of how I've learned to navigate it. Which is why I think leadership is something that everyone is capable of in the instance where people just make a commitment to serve people around them. But I also, oh, I see your comments. Thank you. I think just from a professional perspective, my background is, in the kind of elections management space, but also a little bit of legal practice. I've always believed that, in using my God-given talents and abilities for the benefit of people around me and people with less. So yeah, that's basically who I am, and what I do, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. You mentioned some really interesting things, but I think things that have also put a lot into context with regards to why you then find yourself in this space. I think what I find very, powerful is you saying that you learned the concept of leadership, which ultimately really is about taking initiative and solving problems from within your family, and the fact that you come from a family of change makers. And I think then it makes sense why you would find or you would use, your education, your skills, and your expertise in this particular space. If I'm not mistaken, you are a lawyer by profession, or you studied law.
So I'm not admitted in the High Court, but I
Sure.
did study law. I studied a Bachelor of Arts in Politics, Sociology, and International Relations first, and then I did my LLB. Um,
Sure.
Dropped out of legal practice when I realized that I've always had a very kind of broad breadth of abilities, and I struggle in kind of those strict vocational jobs where you solve the same problems the same way every day.
Yeah.
If you're solving different problems, if you're solving them the same way, it's something I've always kind of struggled with. Of Yeah, I struggle with arrangements like that. So
Yeah.
I've also always felt that, politics is my calling, to the extent that, politics can be a force for change and a force for good,
Mhm.
uh, and a force to kind of like change the lived experiences of people and South Africans in particular. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of my
So
professional background.
So you drop out of legal practice, right? And you could have gone the typical admitted attorney, advocate route. And somehow you find yourself working in election management, and then ultimately you find yourself at Rise. I
Yeah,
want you to explain to us the journey, like exactly how does that happen, and when do you make the decision that I could continue on this path that is probably a lot more secure, a lot safer, a lot more lucrative as well. But actually, I'm called to do something different. And once you've made that decision, what about this particular organization then resonates with the work that you had identified as your calling and the kind of work that it is you want to do with the experience and with the education that you have?
sure. That's a great question, actually. Well, I grew up in the ANC. I grew up in the ANC. My grandmother was a leader in the UDF in the East Rand. My mother was always kind of involved deeply in the work that the ANC does as a kind of independent functionary. Also in the elections management space, it runs in the family. Um, but that was always kind of my initial exposure to politics, right? And I've always had a very nostalgic view of that political party in particular because it was when the ANC when we talk about how the ANC was is and was more, not so much is, but was a broad church. um, I used to think about the ANC felt like what was possible. It felt like remember when you would hear adverts on TV about South Africa alive with possibilities, and this place felt like it felt like possibilities were maybe not
Sure.
abundant, but we were getting there. And at some point, something obviously just switched and broke. Um, but I think in texture, the thing about Rise is, and I incidentally only found the language to explain what drew me to Rise when Zivi started talking about the third way, um, and the third way being a kind of language to explain how Rise captures that social democratic center that lives in the hearts and minds of all South Africans, or the majority of South Africans at least. And I think that's what ultimately brought me here, but also just the integrity of the people we work
Mm,
with. It's one of the first things I mean, I started working for Rise in a voluntary capacity. I volunteered to help build the constitution and the kind of initial legal frameworks that, from a governance perspective, that govern the organization. And I was happy to continue doing that. I was going to continue doing that. But there's just something so infectious about how Rise feels in texture, and in substance, that I realized that it was filling um, a void of purpose, but also a kind of
mm,
spiritual void, because when you are trusted with leading people, when you're trusted with being a representative of people, it's a spiritual thing. It's definitely a calling, and that's kind of how I navigate my own journey. So yeah, I didn't have the way to kind of articulate it until Mr. Z spoke about the third way, and I was like, that's why I'm here.
yeah.
So that's probably why Rise. But I think for the most part, bar none, I haven't seen. And I've worked. I mean, I used to work in a professional sector where political parties were my clients. So I've seen the inner workings of most political parties. I have never seen a political party with this many talented young people, such a deep concentration of talented young people, and I was shocked. So it was a natural home for me. I think Rise is a kind of place where no matter who you are, you will Rise will extract the growth out of you that you have never experienced anywhere else. I could go on and on about why I'm here. There's 4,000 reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, about why you are rising. And I absolutely resonate with that. I won't talk about myself because we are here to get to know you, but I
When is
absolutely relate.
your Fireside Chat?
Coming, it's on the way. But I can relate with what you're saying about just how talented and committed the people that we are privileged to work with at Rise are. And I think you almost can't believe how people have just the authentic desire to
Yeah,
change their
yeah,
community and to
yeah.
change this country, right? And to give it everything that they have. I was having a conversation with Khao the other day, and she is our head of digital, by the way. She's our social media manager. And she was saying that she got to Rise and she had to hit the ground running. There was no time to know people or figure things out because we are, less than a year old and we're building this movement and it's growing so rapidly and we're just 130 days away from elections. So there really isn't a lot of time to get to know people, but you can sense that everyone is on the same page with regards to what we are trying to build. And so
Absolutely.
talk about building a country that is a dignified place to live for all South Africans. That's ultimately, I think, the thing that threads us all together.
Mm.
So, to what you've just said, I absolutely resonate with that. If you have just joined us, welcome. I'm unable to see how many people are actually live, but welcome to our Fireside Chat. This is a series by Rise Mzansi where we get to know members of our National Leadership Collective, or NLC. Today, we're in conversation with Boitumelo Mpakanyane. He is the head of internal democracy. I actually realized that I didn't introduce myself. So my name, my name is Dimpho Lekgeu. I am part of the communications team at Rise. I am responsible for community management as well as internal comms. I want to ask you one last semi-personal question. You've
Sure.
spoken a lot about how, can you still hear me? It just started raining.
I can. Sounds good.
Okay.
Sure.
You spoke about how Rise also filled a void in purpose for you, and how
Mm.
you recognize that being able to lead people, being able to represent people, being able to put forward the very real issues that people come to us with in communities is in fact an issue of purpose. And it's not just a job, right?
Mm.
And it kind of feels like you're on assignment. What are some of those issues for you personally that kind of keep you up at night? We all have different reasons as to why we're part of this movement, why we've chosen to rise, why we decide to do this work every single day. But
Yeah.
when you observe and when you look at our country as it is today, what are some of those issues, man, that kind of just stand at the very top for you?
Sure. I think I mentioned when we started DIMS that I've always considered family the most important institution in a society. The way we navigate our families and the way our families are structured and the ethics and the morals with which
Sure.
we participate in our families then go on to inform um, how what our participation in other institutions in society looks like. And I think I've always had a passion for strengthening democratic institutions, particularly.
Mm,
I've always been a bit of a systems thinker in that way, in the sense that I know that in as much as we think of um, like actual physical institutions in the state as just these things that do kind of loose and undefined things. I mean, if you look at like a Chapter 9 institution like the IEC, the IEC plays such an important role in maintaining this democratic order that we've inherited. You look at institutions like the public protector, and the public protector's mandate is to defend a democracy. When you think about what that means, it's a big job, it's a big
mm,
mandate, and it's a meaningful one. It's such an important one. Um, but we're witnessing this institutional decay happening all around us, where it it seems like it's far away and has nothing to do with us, but that institutional decay ultimately informs whether or not your cousins or yourself or my sister or my aunt or my mother or my daughter one day is going to die giving birth in a public hospital. It informs whether or not people in my family and in yours, children in my family and in yours, have to travel 15, 30, 50 kilometers to go to school because they can't go to the schools in their communities. It informs life and death, and this it's I've always been kind of very, very mindful of the what the very personal consequences of the breakdown of strength in our public institutions means for all of us as individuals. It's difficult for us to sometimes look at these big national policies and have a proper understanding about what it means for us as individuals. But if you've got a government that spends money recklessly and steals money, then it means you can't spend money on a public healthcare system. It means you can't spend money on policing. But also, if you have a reckless government that then fires 15,000 nurses or 20,000 nurses, and then hires 15,000 community health workers, what are we doing? And it's just like the consequence for our communities is that they have to navigate these incredibly important public services that keep people alive, right? That are the difference between life and death. And they are breaking down all around us because we are led by people who either don't have the answers or just simply don't care. And that's what keeps me up at night. I if there's one contribution I make to rise and to my country, it will be a small contribution in elevating the standard of political leadership, and that we send into not just executive levels in the state, but even strengthening the standard of the public administration that delivers services to people. That's really what I want my at least this part of my career to be about. It's things of I don't think we realize just how bad things are. I don't think things are bad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. You're right. And I think part of the reason a lot of us don't realize how bad things are is because we don't make a connection between that hollowing out of public institutions and how it affects our lived realities, right? How
yeah,
that is then connected to the way you're able to access healthcare,
yeah,
as a young woman, the way that how you're able to feel safe in your own community because
yeah,
SAPS, for example, is no longer effective.
yeah,
We don't make the connection, and we don't make that connection because I don't think it's communicated enough.
yeah,
And when it is, I don't know if it's in a language that's accessible enough
mm,
for everyone to engage with. And so there's this frustration, and I think especially amongst young people, where we see the headlines and we know that institutions are running out of money. We know that there's a new CEO at ESCOM every 9 months. We know that there's all of this instability, but we don't really understand what that means for us now and
yeah,
how we're able to access critical services now, but also how we're able to access those services in the future, right?
yeah, exactly.
And that's why I think that even the way that we talk about politics and the way that we talk about politics, especially to young people, is so important
Yeah,
because we need to drive that understanding that politics is actually very personal, which is something that we try to do at Rise. We're always reinforcing the fact that politics is about people. It's not about, Parliament and Cape Town and everything we see on television. It's
union
ultimately about
blue light.
union buildings, and the front page of a Sunday newspaper. It is
Yeah,
ultimately about people. And I think that's why what you're saying about strengthening institutions is so important, because then we find ourselves with a situation where people don't believe in the ability of these institutions to work for them,
yeah,
right?
Definitely.
And so, that's also a very dangerous situation, because what does it mean about our country? What does it mean about democracy if people are opting out? And people just simply don't believe that the institutions that are there to help them, the institutions that are there to make sure that our country functions, can
Mm,
no longer do that. But
exactly.
I want us to shift our focus now a little bit and talk about internal democracy. Earlier, I mentioned that everyone has heard that term, but like no one really knows, what it
Sure,
means or what it is that you do. So, take us through what is internal democracy and what does
sure.
it mean to be the head of internal democracy at Rise and Mzansi?
It's a colorful job, that one. I'll never forget the day I got an appointment letter from our chairperson, and it said internal democracy, and I was like, which one is that one? It's interesting work, because really what it is doing the work of systemizing collective decision making in the organization, right?
Mm,
It is doing the work of making sure that there is a ethic of what the other political party calls democratic centralism, and that's basically the work of seeding down a democratic practice, or certain democratic practices in the organization. This means all sorts of things in a practical sense. It means defining what a public representative candidate selection process might look like. It means defining how dispute resolution mechanisms work in the organization, both for
wait,
operational.
there's more? I
Yours,
thought
you need.
like you're out of a job after candidate selection.
No, unfortunately, it only starts. It only starts.
Hectic.
Uh,
Okay.
it means like I said, defining dispute resolution structures in an organization. Um, it means democratizing. It means getting us to a point where at the end of 2025 we can hold leadership elections in provinces and nationally. It means effectively defining how individuals experience rise as part of a collective. So it has legal implications, it has political implications,
Sure.
has communications implications. But basically, my work is yeah, basically the work of navigating or defining the parameters for how individuals navigate communal spaces, communal decision making, navigate disputes, and all of those things in the context of Rise as a political party. So it's very, very complex work. I once did this. There's a course in my undergrad where we learned about simple, complex, complicated processes. A simple process is something that by nature replicates itself, right? A
Mhm.
complex process is something that has variations in how it manifests, but you can do things to make it do the same thing the same way. It's kind of like a formula on Excel. If you want to uh, add this thing to this thing, and on the next line add this thing to this thing, you can. It's a complicated process, but you can just drag the thing down and it will sort itself out. People problems are complicated processes in the sense that there's no way to systemize or automate things, right? You have to deal with the substance of people problems as they come and as they arise. They are always very, very context specific, always have different sensitivities that you need to navigate and kind of provide for. Um, and that's basically what my work is. So it is, um, I think all of us have jobs in Rise where we're not quite sure what the week holds for us. We have a rough idea what Monday might look like, but from Wednesday onwards, we're blind to it. We have no
Anything
idea.
could happen.
Anything can happen here.
Yeah.
But that's basically my job. And obviously, it's slow in the sense that you have to build an organization. Um, you have to build a political party, and that obviously means growing in numbers and in strength and all of those things. But it also means that to some degree, you also need to kind of that work needs to filter down And it's difficult for any political party when you're in a kind of high growth stage, or any organization in a high growth stage. I mean, um, it's one of the things that broke the ANC. You know, what I mean, this idea that when the ANC decided it wanted to grow to 1 million members, fine, it grew to 1 million members, but it had no ability to make sure that, at the point where it starts deploying people into public
Mm.
governance, it can ensure the quality of those people. It can ensure the quality of their leadership expertise and abilities. So there's pros and cons to growing in a kind of rapid way, and those are the things we have to kind of score for. So that's what internal democracy is, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, I won't lie, I don't know if I fully get it, but I
Sure.
definitely have a better understanding now than I
Yeah.
did when we started having the conversation.
Yeah.
And it sounds very technical, it sounds like very systematic problem solving work,
Yeah.
but it also sounds like it has a lot to do with people, and managing people and interacting with people, and listening
Yeah.
to
Big
people.
time. Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you about candidate selections, but I think this question needs to come next, right? And while we're talking about um, knowing how to listen to people, knowing, just how to engage with people, what would you say are the key principles and values that guide or underpin the work that you do as head of internal democracy at Rise?
Um, Definitely a sensitivity to people's perspectives. You need to have a very, very strong understanding that people won't see the work you do, won't see
Mm,
um, even reality the same way. Our reality and how we process reality is informed by our experiences. Um, and to that degree, when somebody tells you their truth, you need to take them at their word. It means that you have to create collective mechanisms for making decisions, in a way that also doesn't slow down an organization. It allows you, because we're an organization that's young, we're an organization that
mm,
has to kind of monopolize opportunities where they exist, but you also have to make sure that the way decisions are made in an organization consider the needs of everybody who forms part of that organization. It means when people tell you their truth, you need to believe them and then take them at their word. And it means, for the most part, that you need to kind of have a strong sense of what you're trying to provide for. So let's say in the context of candidate selection, the end goal was to make sure that we build a process that selects the best among us to lead, right? And it means
mm,
working back from a goal. It means defining what the best is, right? And then putting in place the processes that get you to that goal ultimately.
mm,
So it's very, very, it's technical from a systems thinking perspective, but there's also certain things you can kind of take for granted, in the sense that if you say that what the best is a talented leader who loves their community, and you want to build a process that selects people like that, then there's certain things you kind of have to take for granted that the process has to have in it, right? It means that the process has to assess a person's dedication to one's community, and that the idea that they must know who their community is. It
mm,
means there's certain things you can take for granted in working back from a goal. Um, so those are the kind of principles that kind of define my work. Um, but yeah, just it's thinking about and making sure that processes and systems cater for people, the kind of most disenfranchised and disadvantaged
mm.
in any community, and even in Rise as a community. So yeah, that's more or less what I would say. But I think probably the extent to which it sounds undefined is because, like I said, people issues are undefined.
Mm,
And there's even instances where we'll have a situation. It's like we're not quite sure where to put this, and I think we kind of all experience this in our jobs where it's like a problem will arise, and it's like where's the appropriate um, forum to deal with an issue, and it's like okay, there's a Dimpho with internal comms, but I don't think it's really an internal comms issue. Maybe it's an ever evolving kind of broad practice. So yeah,
Yeah. And I think you mentioned candidate selections now,
yeah,
and how the process itself was obviously designed to mine the very best leaders who will represent Rise and Mzansi in
yeah,
the National Assembly as well as in provincial legislatures. It would have been so much easier if, the NLC came together and said, these are our people, this is the list we're putting forward. We know
yeah,
these guys, we know their qualifications, these are the Rise and Sansi candidates. And
yeah,
instead, we went on this really like extensive process,
yeah,
um, very involved, very consultative process to ensure that the list that Rise and Zansi ultimately ends up with is reflective of the very, very best leaders
yeah,
who are not just good according to what we have to say, but according to the entire Rise community. I
sure,
think just take me through the designing of that process,
yeah.
and that also explain why it was so important for Rise to have or to approach, candidate nominations and selections differently to what has been done before.
Sure. So part of it was an understanding of the limitations that come with being a very new political party, right? So what a lot of other political parties do is because they have branch structures in wards and in voting districts, they will say to branches, "You tell us who you want inside the organization. Don't
Mm,
tell us about people outside the organization." Um, you nominate branches must nominate people, and then the amount of branches that let's say for instance you get nominated by 1,000 branches and I get nominated by 500 branches, it puts you above me. So basically your ranking on a public list is determined by how many branches nominate you. There are complexities within Rise that we had to cater for, specifically in the sense that obviously we don't have established,
mm,
structures. Even though we're growing at 20,000 people per day, there's, things like that that need to kind of be accounted for. But one of the very core components of even a free and fair election is that I need to be able to access the people who I need to
mhm,
canvass and who I need to attract to vote for me. And when you're growing at 20,000 people per week, it's impossible to do that. It's impossible for me to put you through an election process where you need to kind of canvass a base of Rise and Zanti supporters and volunteers and members to vote for you when that base is in flux and moving so quickly. There's considerations like that, but like I said, the biggest consideration was the kind of candidate that we want to send to the National Assembly.
mm,
We wanted to send a candidate and a public representative that is deeply concerned about their communities. When we say communities, we don't just mean geographical communities, we mean
mm,
psycho communities, we mean issue based communities, and all of those things. But a deep, deep concern about the communities that they come from, about the communities that they want to represent, but also somebody with the talent to implement these solutions. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're not talking about executive management talent. We're talking about organizing talent. We're talking about
sure.
people who experience representatives and mouthpieces of the people they represent. But what was also important is making sure that ultimately the people that we send to parliament and what needs to make Rise and Zanzi's cohort of parliamentary and provincial legislature representatives different to everybody else is that now I've seen the inside workings of parliament, I've seen the inside workings of the NCOP and provincial legislatures. MPs and MPLs are lazy.
Mm,
MP MPLs don't read. They don't submit questions when members of the executive come back to account to the National Assembly or to the NCOP or to even a committee in Parliament. They don't do the work, right? And the biggest thing is that we need to send people who, one, like I said, have the talent, have the passion, but also are willing to do the work. One of the things is every single Monday for National Assembly members is supposed to be a constituency day. And instead of doing constituency work, you have political parties that host their national level working meetings on a Monday. So instead of doing the work you're supposed to be doing in your parliamentary constituency, you're not doing that work. You are furthering your own organization's interests. And it's these are the kind of departures and principles that Rise Mzansi had to take a step away from. We also wanted to take a step away from cadre deployment and how we never had a say in the kind of people that the political parties that we vote for ultimately send on our behalf, right? And what our process does is allow people who even exist outside of the Rise Mzansi ecosystem to have a say in who Rise Mzansi sends to Parliament to represent their interests, because we understand that when we send people to the National Assembly and to the provincial legislature, they're not just going to create solutions for members of Rise Mzansi. They must create solutions that South Africans as a whole benefit from. So these are the kind of things that we thought about very, very closely. And it's ultimately just important that we strengthen that relationship of accountability between a citizen and a public representative that they ultimately have to account to. If you know who you send to the National Assembly and you know that this person represents your community, whether it's your geographic community or your psychographic community, you know that when that person doesn't do what you sent them to do, you can hold them accountable to that, right? And we'll provide the kind of mechanisms and systems and forums for our members to do this. But that's basically what we thought about when we defined the process. It was partly, like I said, a consideration about the organizational limitations that we had, in that we were small. I was reading on Twitter, people were asking who elected this leadership, and it's like, people almost expect you to have an election, nah, and then start a political party. So you must elect. It doesn't make sense, right?
Who
If
elects those people?
who elected even the NLC, right? It's this idea
Yeah,
that the NLC must have been elected. It's at what point must the NLC have to have been elected? Every
sure.
political party has an inaugural leadership team that builds the political party, right? If we're going to start fighting about who elected the NLC absolutely at some point must democratize, and the goal for that is 2025. But what are we going to hand over if we haven't built the organization and built an organization to hand over? Because the risk is that if you democratize an organization too soon, you're going to be having fights over an IEC registration certificate. Fine, great, you win the election. Now you're president of the certificate. It doesn't mean
Yeah,
anything. So ultimately, how we see ourselves as an operational team that you're part of, as political leadership and management team, is the people who, and our field organizers and our volunteers. Rise Mzansi exists as it exists today are the people who have to build the organization that we one day hand over to the leaders who take the vision forward and all of those things. So that's basically what all of the considerations that we made
sure.
in designing the process here.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to also changing political culture, which
Big,
is one of the things that we talk about at Rise and Zansi. One of the things that we have set out to do is
yeah,
to simply change the way that things are done in South Africa's political landscape.
yeah,
One, because it has been ineffective by and large. Secondly, though, because it has created a wedge between people and
yeah,
politicians, right?
yeah.
Where people view politics as this thing that's so like far away. It's on
Mm.
television, it's on the news. Like we said earlier, it's in parliament and in the union buildings,
Yeah,
and people, they can't access the very people who are meant to lead them.
sure.
Even the very people that they have put forward to represent them in various structures. you mentioned something else, and I think I've forgotten it. Yes, Rise Mzansi growing at 20,000 people a week is like no small feat. It's obviously a lot to keep up with, especially when we are only a couple of months away from a very important election. What do you
Yeah.
think it is, Dumi, about Rise, about the way that we do things, again, political culture, about the people at Rise that captures the imagination of South Africans, that captures the heart of South Africans from all corners of this country and even abroad, even South Africans living abroad who've never had or interacted with Rise physically,
Yeah.
so to speak, but who take an interest in the work that we do. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. The I think if I'm going to try and account for our growth, it's simply that we have the most amazing volunteers of any political party in the country. I will die on that mountain. I will fall on that sword.
That's your hill.
Fight me to death on that point. We have the most amazing volunteers, but I think part of why we've been able to build that broad basis, specifically, like you say, Dims, this thing of us pushing hard and endeavoring to change political cultures. Nothing about how we have done things up until this point has been consistent with what the establishment does. Our process of building a manifesto was a process of consulting over 120 towns, cities, villages, townships,
Sure.
just communities across the country, and getting an understanding of the issues that inform their experiences. And we were criticized all over the place. We were said the people said, no man, these people need to understand this isn't a local government election, it's a national election. But we also understand that national policies have local government implications, right? Because they ultimately impact the service touch points that people have to navigate when they interact with the state, our candidate selection process is another departure away from conventional political norms where you have political parties telling a country after you voted for them that these are the people we're sending to
Sure.
represent your interests. So Rise and Zanzi in many, many ways is a big departure away from the political cultures that have come to define political parties in South Africa and just politics in general. And I think that messaging and that the fact that we live those principles is what probably accounts for our ability to grow at 20,000 people a week. I think when it's one thing to say to people, for the people, by the people, but what does that mean? What mean when you use slogans like 2024 is our 1994? You're capturing a promise, an old promise of a life of safety and prosperity and equality, and you're making it possible again after 30 years of maybe a good 10, 12 years, and then another 15 years of just reversing those
Yeah.
gains. People have had to see life getting more and more difficult over time, after people have had to contend with building a little bit of upward economic and social mobility, being able to feed their families in a moment. And then in 2012, when kind of our economy stopped growing and GDP per capita capped and income stopped rising, but inflation is rising. When life gets harder and South Africans get poorer, we have to stop and reflect and think, what was the promise of 1994 and how do we fulfill it again? And that's what it means to say 2024 is our 1994. It's not a statement of minimizing or reducing what the promise of 1994 is. If anything, it is a very, very strong and keen understanding of what that
Mm.
promise meant, what this moment gives us the opportunity to do in changing the course of our country. I've forgotten what your question was, but I've gone into a passionate rant. Um, so,
Answered it somewhere in there. My question was around what do you think it is about Rise and how we do things that
uh,
really captures the imagination of South Africans. I mean, I work in internal comms, and so I see a lot of those messages, that first contact that a lot of people have with the organization, and
Mm,
people are incredibly passionate
mm,
about being a part of this organization. And a lot of people sometimes don't even know what we do.
mm.
Um, People ask, "Are you guys are you a party?" I'm not quite sure, but I like what you're doing,
Yeah,
and I want to be a part of it. And so I think you answered that in saying it's how we have moved away from the conventional way of doing things and really put into practice what it means to say things like 2024 is our 1994. It's not just
sure.
another hashtag for us. It's not
Yeah,
just another catchphrase. And when we say things like for the people, by the people, and traveling across the country to listen, to what South Africans say are their most pressing issues, and
yeah,
putting that on the manifesto rather
mm,
than what we think and
yeah,
what we talk about on a daily basis.
yeah,
I see
yeah.
a few comments showing up on the screen, so I'm not going to repeat them. I think Cam has put them on the live. We don't have a lot of time left. We have about 9 minutes, but I really want us to get into the relationship between young people and politics in South Africa at this moment. And it's, I think, a necessary conversation to have because you're obviously very young and you've already
Yeah. But yeah, I'm very young. I'm
still
very
very young. You're on the older side of young, but you're young nonetheless. um,
exactly.
and you've already dedicated so much of your time and just experiences to, I guess, building or working on South Africa's political landscape. And now you're obviously doing that. You're doing that at Rise. I think that when we talk about politics and young people, it's such an interesting thing because according to statistics, right,
Mm,
we know that young people haven't been voting,
yeah,
and that youth voter turnout is on the decline at an alarming rate.
mm,
I think the percentage of young people 18 and 19 who are registered to vote is the lowest out of any other demographic. I think the
yeah,
number is 50 to 29.
yeah.
That's very concerning because, that's a huge chunk. I think the biggest chunk
Of our
um, of, of
democrat,
our
yeah,
electorate, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, but on the flip side, you think about historically things like 1976, and obviously the dent in politics that young people made during the Soweto uprising. You think about things like Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall and all the other fallist movements.
yeah,
But then also think about things like service delivery protests, which are very common in our country, which are led by young people.
yeah,
And so we know that young people are politically charged,
mm,
but they're not voting.
yeah,
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we see that happening?
yeah.
And my second question would then be, how do we remedy the relationship that young people have with politics in such a way that we get young people to believe in the system of democracy again?
Mm. You know, I love that broad and very that framing you give about how deeply political young people are is such a powerful one because it just goes to show that when people talk about how young people don't care about politics, young people are disaffected with politics, you couldn't be more wrong. No one is more political than young people in South Africa.
Yeah.
Um, I think the issue ultimately, though, is that the establishment and representative politics and, you know, um, just the politics of in how our democracy functions has signaled to young people many, many times, actually on a daily basis, that it doesn't care about them. We've got a political establishment that has fostered and created a situation and a context now where 58% of young people aren't employed. Um, where we have, on one side of the coin, a lack of opportunities for young people, but then on the other side of the coin, we have an unemployable base of young people who are entering the
Mm,
work, entering the labor force, because we haven't equipped them with the skills and the abilities to be able to participate in our economy meaningfully, because we failed them at a basic education level, because they
yeah.
get one day and suffer from stunting, and because of that can't finish school, because young girls don't have basic, basic kind of period care and menstruation sanitary towels, and just the basics necessary to be able to navigate life on a daily basis. And because
Mm,
of that, have to drop out of school. And the establishment has failed young people. So why should the establishment continue? Why should young people continue to invest
sure.
in it, right? Because you've signaled to me many, many times that you don't care about us. But even in situations where young people have tried to enter politics, politics has always been an incredibly, incredibly antagonistic space towards young people, an incredibly paternalistic space towards young people, where we've got, I mean, our Minister of Women, Children, Youth, and People with Disabilities is in her 80s, and it's like we are told that the people who have the solutions to our problems is the people who won't even see the future, because
Mm,
their life is behind them. So it's ultimately, young politics has showed us that it couldn't care less about us if it tried. In terms of what it would take to solve that, I think it's up to us, and specifically this organization, because I think we're probably best placed to do it, but to remind young people that um, representative politics plays an incredible role in shaping your outcomes. It
mm,
probably plays the biggest role in determining whether or not 5, 10 years from now we're still talking about a youth unemployment crisis, because we either have fixed the basic education system and we're exiting more people out of matric than the 48% we're dealing with now, or we
mm,
haven't. Right? We've either fixed the stunting that young kids in the Eastern Cape and Limpopo and Mpumalanga have to deal with, that as a consequence mean that they can't finish school, or we haven't. We've either eradicated the 1,900 pit latrine toilets in Limpopo in public schools, or we haven't. We've either fixed the fact that kids are learning under school, under trees, and not in adequately resourced classrooms, or we haven't. And that's what politics ultimately has the ability to do. So I think it's up to this organization, because I don't see another organization that's better placed to do that work, to change how young people navigate and interact and interface with politics. And how we do that is not by relegating young people to leagues and whatever. Young people are in the core functioning and leadership and management of Rise Mzansi. Young people can see
mm,
themselves at the forefront of this organization, and it's not tokenistic. One of the most powerful things about Rise Mzansi is we've got your people like Ntate Ishmael Mkabela, we've got your Prof. Nick Benadals. But when I say something in an NLC meeting that is in the interest of young people, Prof. Nick listens to me. When Faiza
mm,
says something, Ntate
mm.
Ish listens to her. And the same goes for Lawrence, who's 20. Lawrence is 21 or 20.
21. He'll be
21.
21 this year. He had just
Exactly.
turned 20. Yeah.
Exactly. Lawrence is 21. But when Lawrence says something in a meeting, Mr. Z listens to him. Songizar listens to
Mm,
him. And it's not this tokenistic tick box exercise of allowing young people participation in the leadership of an organization. It is a sincere understanding that we're not going to be able to take young people along for the ride if we don't let them drive the car. And I think ultimately, like I said, I don't know another organization that's better placed to do that work than we are. So it's obviously a big responsibility and a big burden that the young people in Rise Mzansi have to deal with and contend with on a daily basis. But as representatives of this organization, when we do work in communities, when we represent the organization in media, on social media, in our
mm.
family, in in our communities, that's the work that we need to be doing. We need to be activating young people and remind them that politics, representative politics, matters so much in shaping their outcomes.
Sure. And Gwen T says, It is inspiring to see young people taking the road less traveled. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you so much for tuning in. You're absolutely right, Dumi. I think also because there are so many young people who are part of the political staff, but also operational staff at Rise, you kind of like forget that you're young. I don't know if that makes sense because you're just
Listen,
surrounded by
I
so
know
many of
exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
you're just surrounded by so many of your peers that it feels normal. And until you turn on the television and you kind of see how other political parties are doing things, and you realize actually, when it comes to not just saying things like young people should lead and the youth are the future, which
Yeah.
is another statement that is thrown around. Like Rise actually puts their money where their mouth is.
Yeah.
Young people are leading the organization, young people are building the organization, but also young people are being listened to. This
Yeah.
is a collaborative effort that relies on the wisdom of the older generation, like you mentioned, the Ishmael and some of our older leaders, but also the energy, I think the ideas and the talents of young people. And I think to my earlier question about what sets Rise apart, I actually think that's one of the things that people can't ignore about Rise and Mzansi is
Yeah.
the amount of talented, quality young leaders who are a part of building the organization. I have two more questions left, so I'm going to ask you to stay on for 5 minutes.
Sure.
I have one last question around young people in politics, and then my final closing question.
Sure.
You mentioned that, we need to do a lot of activating young people to understand why representative politics is so important, and why young people need to participate. And there was a clip on social media doing the rounds not so long ago on Twitter, where young people were attempting to have a political conversation, and it was misinformed. I'm not sure if you saw it, but it was something around what would happen in the elections and the Cape Independence and so on and so forth.
Sure.
So I think the positive thing is that young people are talking about politics because, like we said, young people are actually very concerned with what happens in their country. But there also seems to be just not enough platforms where young people can learn,
Yeah.
where young people can get credible information about South Africa's political landscape and how they get involved. Do you
Yeah.
think that things like social media and the digital space, is there an opportunity to use those things to activate young people? Are we missing that opportunity? Are we using social media the wrong way? What's your take on that quickly before we close?
Sure. So, firstly, actually, where I want to start is that I want to point out that I have seen 40 and 50-year-old political analysts say things that are even more uninformed than what those kids were talking about.
Yeah,
So, in as much as it is obviously there is a political literacy issue among South African youth, there is a general political literacy issue in South Africa generally. I've
sure.
seen people in their 40s say stupid things, but I think what's important is that we must stop being arrogant and we must stop assuming that young people are going to come to us where we are, right? We must stop assuming that, if you've got a message you want to disseminate to young people, but you're gonna go and do it on Newsroom Africa at 3 p.m. It's not the
Sure.
place to do it. And I think politics as a culture has made that assumption that I think the older generation makes the assumption that young people must gravitate to them, and it's in the little things, right? It's in even just the interactions that we have as young people with older generations. But ultimately, the issue is that we're not meeting young people where they are. And even in instances where we don't do it properly, right? So you have political parties that have TikTok accounts, and are trying to kind of message politics and package politics for young people on that
Mm,
platform, but you're communicating it the same way you would on Newsroom Africa. So what are we doing
yeah.
here, right? So there's there's those things, and even in the process of kind of packaging and programming politics, right, from an organizing perspective, you can't expect to capture young people and the imagination of young people if you're going to program politics from an organizing perspective the same way we've been programming it for the past however many decades with branch meeting and all of those things. We don't the
Yeah.
young people do those things, right? And it's ultimately, like I say, you must go to young people where they are, and you must grow their political literacy from there. But ultimately, like I say, I think the biggest variable is that if young people are going to have a relationship with politics where they are antagonized the way that they are, the way we are. I mean, even in the context of that video, um, what I don't think is the correct response is then demonizing young people for talking about politics, no matter how misinformed it is. I'm happy, I'm so excited that young people are talking about politics. But like I said, I've seen older people say nonsense
Sure.
that makes absolutely no sense and has no basis in fact. So there's those things. We must be very sensitive in how we package young political messages and visions, even for young people. But ultimately, it must be a very humble practice of meeting young people where they are.
Hmm.
When we meet them where they are, they must be met by young people who are leading organizations.
I like that. It needs to be a humble practice of meeting young people where they are. And I think, once again, that's something that Rise Mzansi has managed to do so incredibly well. We
Mm.
mentioned Lawrence earlier. So, Lawrence leads our youth and student chapters. Uh, Help me out, Dumi. He leads
Uh,
youth and student chapters. We can't call it Raj, but he's our youth and student chapters. And his entire team is young people.
yeah,
And I think they have managed to get right is talking with young people and not at them. And
yeah,
I think you mentioned a bit of that in your response.
yeah.
That we think we know what we want to say to young people, and we just go to young people with this information, and we kind of want to shout it at them instead
Mm.
of engaging with them and actually creating dialogue with young people about how they engage with politics, how they interpret, politics, and what doing politics in a way that's effective for them,
Mm.
2024 looks like. So
Exactly.
before we wrap up, very, very important for us to mention that we are launching the People's Manifesto in, I think the countdown is now at 7 days.
Yeah,
In
something.
7 days, on the
Yeah,
20th of January at the Hartfelt Arena in Pretoria, we're going
six
to
days.
have, yes, next Saturday.
Mm.
We're going to have over 4,000 Rise Field organizers, supporters, leaders, who will then unveil, the manifesto that, as Tumi mentioned, took a very long and consultative process to put together, including all of the deliberations that took place at the Rise People's Convention. And so, with that being said, Tumi, as someone who has been a very integral part of building Rise, what does this moment mean to you? The unveiling of the manifesto.
That document is a deeply emotional one because it is the culmination of all of those incredibly vulnerable community meetings where you had women tell you about the crisis of safety in their communities and how, in many instances, they're victims of sexual violence. It is a culmination of consultations and meetings where people tell you that they've been unemployed for 10 years and
Mm.
don't have food to put on the table. And it is, you think back to all of those conversations, you think back to how emotionally charged those interactions were and how human they were. And you look at the manifesto and you wonder whether or not we've done justice to all of those experiences. And it has been such an incredibly long. Our policy team is different. Like our policy team is different, and I think it's one thing to just craft a manifesto and build a manifesto and look at it and be like, okay, this sounds good. But
Mm,
when a manifesto comes into being from a process like that, the process of thinking, am I proud of this document as a piece of work, is a different consideration altogether, because you are thinking about all of those interactions that created the document that is what it is. But we've also spent an entire year, or maybe even longer, talking about how 2024 is our 1994. It's 2024 now. You know,
mm,
that promise of 1994 is either going to has to resonate in that document. If it's not going to be captured in that document, then we've lied to South Africans, right? We've lied to Rise and Mzansi volunteers and supporters and everybody who's engaged our work and up until this point. But like I say, having seen it, I am so proud of that document as a piece of work, and as a representation of the vulnerability of South Africans who have shared their experiences in creating what
mhm,
that manifesto is. It is. I'm not. It's not so much about the document itself. It's about how we got there.
mm.
It's a very, very emotional moment for me, just because it is, like I said, a big departure away from how these documents are created. Let's write something, get a policy team to put some interventions together. This sounds good, and the biggest consideration
Some
and
catchy phrases.
is exactly is does it sound good, right?
Mm,
There's a lot of things in Rise and Zanzi's manifesto that aren't catchy phrases. They are laborious and tedious, and if you don't care about communities, you'll think they're boring interventions, right? Because we're not talking about burning down the Reserve Bank, and we're not talking about those things, right? We're talking about building functional institutions, and that isn't a charged conversation. Um, so, but it's what South Africans have asked for, and it is a stunning document. I love that thing.
mm,
Stunning
mm.
document. I'm very, very excited to share the vision of that document with South Africans on the 20th. But I think for the most part, I'm very, very excited to demonstrate what bold thinking can do in when we look back at this moment 10, 15 years from now, 20 years from we talk about building a safe, prosperous, united and equal South Africa in one generation. At the end of this generation, looking back at the outcomes of this manifesto, and we look and think back to 2023 and 2024, and that document was kind of the salient anchor that anchors our
Sure,
progress into the future. I can't wait for that. So
sure.
yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. What better way for us to wrap this up than with you professing your love for the Rise People's Manifesto?
I'm a married.
um, Look, I get it. I'm not judging you at all, and I can't wait to read it. But I think most importantly, we all can't wait to share it with South
Mm,
Africans and to share it with the communities, like you say, who
mm,
put it together.
mm,
Essentially, and who shared their experiences with us so honestly, and with so much vulnerability.
mm.
And so, yeah, all roads lead to Heartfelt Arena on the 20th. Like I said, we can't wait for the day, but most importantly, I think we can't wait to share the document with the rest of the country, with the rest of our community, and break
Yeah,
down together, what it means to us, and what it will mean for us to see the document
yeah,
also come alive. Dumi, thank you so
exactly.
much for your time this evening. I know it's been a particularly long week for you, so I really do appreciate you coming onto Fireside Chats and giving us some inside scoop, so to speak, some insights into who you are, and I think most importantly, what informs the work that you do. What are the things in your mind and in your heart that drive you to do this work, and that keep you going? So Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Head of Internal Democracy. This has been this has been so much fun. Any last words? Any parting shots? You can also just say good night, South Africa. That's fine, by the way.
No, sincerely, I just want to thank Rise Volunteers. I am amazed every single day at what the people who are building this organization are able to achieve on a
Mhm.
daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. In a South Africa where people are so tired of politics and so disaffected with politics and don't want to hear anything else, to be going
Mhm.
at the rate that we are is shocking, right? And it just speaks to one, the ability of our volunteers to package the message of Rise
Sure.
to communities and to deliver that. But honestly, I just want to thank everybody who's played a role in participating in all of the initiatives that this organization has put out, be it candidate selection, our the manifesto itself, or even just the day-to-day work of a field organizer or volunteer. We're different. This place is different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. We saw a few questions, excuse me, comments on Facebook and on YouTube. We will see you guys again next week, same time, 6:30 p.m., when we get to know another member of our National Leadership Collective, or NLC. And until then, good night. Take care. And yeah, 2024 is our 1994. How else you sign up?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susan.